Well, I actually, in the book on value, I proposed a distinction between what I called Marxian and Maussian approaches to the, as a different ways to engage politically with anthropology. And I suggested that in a way you could think of Marx as, if taken to his logical conclusion, the Marxist model as a kind of logic of critique, whereby the way of interpreting any particular phenomena is to see how it ties into a specific totality, which can then be typologized in some way. This is why Marx famously was unwilling to theorize what communism might be like, since we can't really think outside the particular totality that we're in. And it struck me that Mauss really, in his political work, represented the opposite principle. Being a cooperativist, he sort of saw possibilities everywhere. And he was particularly interested in the way that almost all social possibilities are simultaneously present. And any given phenomena, one could imagine how it could be imagined as part of some other alternative totality. I mean, both approaches, if taken in their pure form, have obvious pitfalls. One tends towards the logic of cynicism, sort of ruthless critique of everything. Another one towards a certain naivete. But it seems interesting to me when you look at Mauss's writing that there seems to be two intellectual poles that are pulling away at each other at all times. On the one hand, he has this tendency to organize his whatever he's looking at, whether it's prayer or the gift, the person, so forth, in evolutionary terms. But on the other hand, he also seems to imply that everything, in a certain sense, actually is there at the same time. And what evolutionary stages really mark is which particular aspect is sort of taken as the paradigm for humanity. This comes out very clearly in the conclusion of the gift, where he says that market exchange, the notion of interest, commercial interest, has existed for generations and thousands of years, but it's only quite recently that the bourgeoisie has come to such a position where their characteristic modes of interaction have then become the basis for how we imagine humanity. Man is a calculating machine, as he puts it, which implies that a gift economy is not an economy where all exchanges take place on the basis of gifts, but rather where the predominant strata is engaged in that as their predominant mode of activity, and therefore that becomes the way of imagining what humans actually are. And I thought that would be really interesting to look at that question in relation to communism. And actually, if you look at the manual of ethnography, actually says, this has some bearing on our earlier conversation about individualism. It says, the fundamental mistake is to oppose communism and individualism. In fact, you can have individualistic communism. And he proposes that any relationship between two people which seems to operate on a communistic logic can be thought of as itself a form of communism. Societies thus are threaded by relations of individualistic communism. This key paragraph here, he actually says that when he talks about the total prestation or total reciprocity, what he really means is communism. It's the same thing. It's a certain notion of communism whereby he's essentially rejecting the notion that communism is essentially about property relations in the formal sense, but is rather a matter of rights of access in the pragmatic sense. And I thought this would be a very interesting place to start. I should point out that he makes this move consistently in the manual. He points out that individualism and communism should not be opposed. He makes a similar move of democracy and monarchy, that all political systems tend to involve both. He points out that money exists almost everywhere. Markets actually are kind of interesting because he first says that sometimes markets don't exist at all. The Celtic world, he says, seem to not have them. Then he says, but really, actually, almost everywhere they exist, or at least in some fundamental, their elements exist. The Celtic example seems to be taken from Hubert, who was writing a book on Celtic history at the time, and seems to be referring to the fact that coinage only disseminated to the Celtic world in the 2nd century BC. At any rate, to get back to the total prestation, so you have this idea that there are all these different elements mixed up together and integrated in different ways, and at certain points some become the basis of communism. So I thought that, well, perhaps, if the word primitive communism means anything, and I'm not sure it does, it's those social orders in which that becomes the paradigm for people's definition of humanity. And there's actually one quote which I think brings that home really nicely. Most people have probably heard the famous saying, gifts make slaves as whips make dogs. Marshall Solins has quoted this on many examples, and it sort of appears over and over again. It's usually taken to be a quote about the agonistic gift and the dangers within it. Actually, if you look at the original quote, it seems to come from Peter Freutchen's Book of the Eskimo. Solins denies this. He thinks it comes from a guy named Rink, but it seems to have been a standard Eskimo phrase that was used a lot. It's a cliche. But the longest quote about it is Peter Freutchen was living in northern Greenland, went on a walrus hunt. He didn't catch anything. A friend of his did, and gave him this gigantic slab of walrus meat, and he thanked him. And the guy objected strongly to this. He said, "Up in our country, quote, we are human," said the hunter. "And since we are human, we help each other. We don't like to hear anybody say thanks for that. What I get today, you may get tomorrow. Up here, we say that by gifts one makes slaves, as by whips one makes dogs." I thought it's a nice quote because it shows very clearly what's going on. I mean, it acknowledges that other potentials are there in society. It's not like saying we are a society where we only do one thing. We have all sorts of things that are going on. But what we take to be the basis of actual humanity are relations where we do not calculate. And obviously by gifts, he's referring to something very specific. But it brings home also the fact that the word gift is used to refer to many different types of relationship. And I thought that in the spirit of Mauss, Mauss uses these terms somewhat roughly at times. To some degree, he was dealing with very limited ethnographic data, as he himself frequently admits. For example, it's clear that certain times he allows himself to dip into obvious anachronism where he deals with interest rates, particularly the notion of interest always existing. He's being confused by mistakes in Boaz's ethnography of the Quakiudal. So I thought, well, maybe it would be useful, especially given the tendency we have to, and this comes, of course, from Lévi-Strauss's reinterpretation of Mauss, to take everything on the basis of reciprocity, to point out that there are different sorts of things being bundled together in what we call the gift, which Mauss himself often recognized were different, and to provide sort of a limited typology of how this might work. There are some things which we typologize as gifts that do work on reciprocal grounds, and others that clearly don't. So in that spirit, I thought I would throw out three possibilities here. And one I will call communism. One I will call exchange, in which both gift exchange, when it's explicitly matter exchange, and commercial exchange can be lumped. And finally, logic of hierarchy, which I think doesn't work on reciprocal grounds at all, but actually operates by a logic of precedent. I'll do them quickly. Yeah, I know, very quickly, unfortunately. It's all laid out in the paper in great detail. Now, taking off from Mauss's idea that communism exists and can exist even on an individual basis, I think that what he's basically saying is when you have relations that operate on the logic of from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs, no matter what context, this could be thought of as a communistic relationship. So rather than primitive communism being something that once happened, and what I call mythological communism, once communism, someday there may be again, it's easier to think as communism as a kind of a omnipresent baseline of all human relationships. Both forms of mutual aid, all forms of cooperation. I always make the point that even when working within a corporation, if someone says, hand me the wrench, if you're working on a common task, you don't say, what do I get for it? You apply a sensible communistic logic because it's actually the most practical one. But there's also an assumption that anybody who's not your enemy, there's a certain level at which, if the need is great enough, or if the cost of meeting the need is small enough, anyone is expected to answer, which might be a matter of getting a cigarette if you're part of a community of addiction, giving directions, or if the need is great enough if someone's drowning. But in some societies it's food, it depends. And often it's incredibly difficult not to respond to such a request.